I was going to write an intro here, but there's nothing to say. So, you know the drill. Watch the last 2 parts if you haven't already. Let's do this.
The salami lid ain't gonna fit, won't fit. So the salami lid won't fit.
We begin with Oscar attempting to fend off his allegedly marijuana-induced auditory hallucinations. Osmond straight up reads his mind without any sort of consent, and when Oscar is obviously angry, he tells him that their auras and souls are combined, as are their thoughts, and proves it by showing that Oscar can describe how the headmaster's office at Haven looks, something Ozpin knew. That's fair enough, but I'm still a bit confused, even after seeing Volume 6, as to how this Ozma reincarnation thing isn't more well known. I mean, it was established in Volume 6 that Ozma's had the ability to reincarnate for a long fucking time. I'd imagine after a while someone would have to see the odd pattern of person hears voice in their head, person dies, new person starts hearing the same voice, and notice something was up. I find it kind of hard to imagine something like Ozma's reincarnation ability would get by for that long without raising any eyebrows. Word of a supernatural being manifesting itself in people's minds isn't something that people would just dismiss, especially in a world like Remnant. Why did this go overlooked? Jacques is very angry and is yelling at Weiss for what happened at the party. And to be fair, this scene actually isn't that bad. Aside from the usual painfully stilted dialogue, bad animation, awkward bug eyes, and Lego minifigure shoulders, it actually does a much better job at establishing the relationship between Weiss and Jacques than the office scene in episode 2. We discover that Weiss is no longer the heiress to the family company, with Whitley now being in that position. Did I mention that Whitley is the reincarnation of Double Omega Mecha Hitler Satan? Not just because that's the point. He spouts condescending nonsense that doesn't need to be said. He makes unnecessary facial expressions all the time that are emphasized for no reason. He has literally no redeeming qualities. He exists solely to be an asshole. I could go for hours, but I'm pretty sure most of you can agree. Whitley, she sucks, he's the worst, and I hate him. Weiss cries for approximately 5 seconds at this realization and decides to move shit in her room around to create an open space. And while in the process of doing so, she closes her transparent curtains. We then cut to Team It Literally Doesn't Matter and Crow, currently fighting Tyrion. Again, I've already said what I have to say about this volume's fights in general, but this one is actually pretty telling of what was to come later on. This fight blatantly, desperately tries to capture the snappy energy the fights in the first 3 seasons had, but it's evident here more than ever that they've lost what made those fight scenes enjoyable. Yeah, it's fast, but it also feels sluggish as fuck, and like many other fights this season, it stops every 5 seconds to show something happening outside of the fight. And while I'm not saying shifting the focus away from the fight every now and then is an inherently bad thing, doing it as much as it's being done here massacres any sense of pacing it may have had, turns the fight into a choppy mess. They look at me, I can fight choreography for a while until Tyrion is able to knock Crow's sword out of his hand. Now, anyone with any sense here would see that the biggest obstacle between you and your target is currently unarmed, and that this is the very best opportunity you have to attack. Instead, Tyrion just stands there and lets Crow punch him in the face multiple times, and then comes one of the dumbest scenes in this entire series. Worse than some of the shit in Volume 5. Crow just walks over to get his sword, and Tyrion just sits there and watches. He only goes to attack after Crow has a hold on his sword. If there was some honor thing at play here with Tyrion's character, I could kind of understand. But we've already established that it's very much the contrary with Tyrion, so he's just a fucking idiot. An instrumental version of Bad Luck Charm starts playing halfway through this fight, and it's actually even worse than with This Life Is Mine in episode 6. The audio mixing is even more atrocious, the reverb is out of control, the vocal track has been compressed to hell and is highly focused on the left stereo channel for some reason. That, plus the dialogue, plus the fight, it was too fucking much. My brain stopped working. I just cracked the fuck up. Crow saves Ruby from a falling support beam, leaving himself open yet again. But this time, Tyrion actually takes advantage of that, something that the rest of Ruby's team failed to do for the entirety of the last episode and most of this one. He was actually able to calculate in his Omega Galaxy brain that opponents standing still equals good time to attack. I applaud him for that, but if he was going for the kill, I don't see why he went for the side. Ruby then realizes Tyrion left himself open and cut off his tail. We're getting closer to sense. For now, Tyrion is now disarmed and at a disadvantage when it's obvious he has 2 options, attack again or run. And the rest of the team decides it's a good idea for all 3 of them to stand between him and Ruby. I'd imagine the better option would be to surround him and then ask a lot of very serious and important questions, maybe or maybe not pertaining to who he is, and details as to why he's after Ruby, but we've obviously established that whatever sense Team Juniper had died along with Pyrrha. To be honest, This may be the least terrible episode so far. Keep in mind, I have no fucking idea what kind of hallucinogenic chemicals Murder of Birds was ingesting in order to come to the conclusion that this was the best RWBY episode he'd ever seen. There's still monumental amounts of stupid here, just nothing CCT Tower bad.
Ow! I had to fucking jump in.
Was that the bite of 87?
Crow's explaining the maidens and the relic to the gang, and they all seem a little bit too surprised by this information. I could go into why I think the relics are dumb and unnecessary, but in a world where there are creatures born from darkness, constantly scraping away at human civilization, some mineral allows people to obtain what are essentially magic powers, and the moon is literally fucking broken, I don't think that the concept of seasonal magic people that are the RWBY equivalent of Edward Elric and antique MacGuffins is that outlandish. I genuinely don't understand why they're that shocked. John's also really persecutive towards Crow for some reason. I can understand his perspective towards Beacon's administration because of what happened with Pyrrha, but geez, do you really have to be going after Crow so hard? He didn't do anything. I plan to go into more detail about things related to this in part 4, but Ruby's voice has always been high-pitched, but it was at least tolerable before. Now it just sounds comically nasally and obnoxious. I can't take anything she says seriously anymore. It also doesn't help that at some point between seasons 3 and 4, she apparently lost the ability to have coherent thought to the point where I genuinely doubt she'd be able to put a puzzle together without instructions. Literally all she does anymore is ask questions. Crow then goes into a generic beginning of the world exposition dump, explaining how light made good things and dark made bad things, but then agreed to make humans a not bad or good thing. Fair enough. But what happened after that is a cascade of stupid the likes of which is only paralleled by the plot of Naruto Blood Prison. He explains the relics again and says that Osmond's predecessor built and founded the schools partly to guard the relics so they'd be more easily defended and so they'd be surrounded at all times by trained warriors. Problem being, Beacon has the structural integrity of Smash Ultimate's netcode, and when it was actually attacked, the vast majority of your trained warriors were told to leave at the first sign of danger, so A for effort. Also, Osmond's predecessor, using Osmond's apparent age of somewhere in his late 30s as a reference point, probably hid the relics somewhere from 50 to 90 years ago. I find it kind of hard to believe that the relics, powerful enough if collected to be able to essentially edit the source code of the world at a whim, would be completely forgotten by the entire public and become part of belief and legend at that short of time without some 1984 level social manipulation going on, especially considering it apparently took from the beginning of the world until then for someone to hide them. And here we encounter another big problem. RWBY has this weird thing where it sets out a vague outline for a section of its timeline using an exposition dump or whatnot, but instead of later coming back and filling parts in, it just keeps adding more vague outlines to other parts in its timeline. This was done in the first episode, excusable since it was only getting started, done again here, and again in Volume 6. But the problem is that we don't have a timeline to elaborate on. So far, we only have creation of world, a bunch of miscellaneous events that happen, most of which have no confirmed date or place in the timeline and or are completely irrelevant to the story, events of RWBY. Again, I'm not asking for an essay, I just want to know if the show even has a continuity. We then cut to Blake, with possibly the greatest opening and closing door animation ever made. You've probably noticed by now, but this episode, aptly named A Much Needed Talk, has been completely comprised of dialogue. All of it has been talking. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, a common criticism of Volume 4 is that it's all talking and nothing actually happens. A completely valid criticism because the majority of Volume 4 is useless exposition that was never elaborated on later on. This episode doesn't provide anything useful or interesting, just more exposition and Blake whining. Did I mention Blake whining? I wouldn't have as much of a problem with Blake in this scene if this scene hadn't pretty much defined her entire character from that point on. This scene in specific was the point where her entire character was thrown out in favor of Faunus. Since this scene, she has done nothing other than be sad about the Faunus. Again, I plan to go more in depth into the sheer amount of character derailment this season did in part 4, so stay tuned if you want to see me get really mad. Good sun moment, and they didn't actually completely nuke the timing. Good job. Cut back to Team I'm Not Repeating the Name Anymore. John asks a series of pretty understandable questions, such as why does the world seem to be completely unaware of the fact or even the possibility that Beacon was more than just a terrorist attack? Might I add, despite the fact that the attack was carried out using swarms of Grimm, and Cinder's "this was not a tragedy" speech on top of everything. Why are the other kingdoms sitting on their hands instead of doing anything? Crow responds by saying they keep things quiet about the relics for the same reason they do the maidens, that there'd be panic if people were actually aware of it. I can understand that with the maidens, sort of. But it's not as if the relics have been hidden under guard for that long. I mean, again, Osmond's predecessor couldn't have hid them in the schools more than 90 years ago. Where were they before that? And so we cut back to Blake, complete with more slapping. Sun's trying to tell Blake about how he'd heard from her mom that White Fang members don't wear masks in Menagerie, but that he did see one with a mask in the market the previous day. Blake doesn't give a shit and throws his scroll into the surrounding forest when he tries to show her a picture. Good fucking going, Blake. Someone from a known terrorist organization wearing a mask where none of their members are known to wear masks? It doesn't take Einstein to realize that's probably a prelude to something very not good and very dangerous. Regardless, they then hear a strange noise, which they discover to be a spy. That's really, really bad at spying. The moment she's spotted, she jumps into plain fucking sight with her White Fang mask on. What was the thought process? Back to Team, you get it, waking up the next morning to discover that Crow's wound is turned purple, and he's now coughing up purple blood. Two things. One, if the venom is strong enough to turn his blood purple, he should have been dead a long fucking time ago. Two, nobody out of this team of 4 trained warriors thought about the prospect that maybe, just maybe, there was fucking poison in that scorpion tail. Oh, calm down. Why are you here? I actually can't wrap my head around how stupid these characters are now. It's actually fucking fascinating how incapable they are of basic thought without having every little piece of information told to their faces. Let's just move on. What is this button do? Get the fuck out. I really like RWBY's soundtracks. Some of them. A recurring theme in this video has been throwing out important pieces of plot and world building and just never developing them. The reason I'm mentioning the soundtracks here, completely disregarding for a minute the fact that their quality in general goes sharply downhill from Volume 5 onward, is that for some reason, the writers for RWBY have this thing where they'll lay foundation for a plot element in the show, and they just never develop it. And when they realize that they forgot to develop it, they just dump that job on the songs. Let's have a talk about the Kagero Project for a minute. As I explained in my video about Makaku City Actors, the Kagero Project is a mixed media project consisting of manga, music videos, anime, light novels, and yeah, but the main thing about it is that it's made up of multiple different forms of media, and while the execution and storytelling might be a bit lackluster at times, to experience that story you do need to watch, listen, read, and suffer through all of them. There isn't one main component to the story, is what I'm saying. RWBY is not that. RWBY is an anime with soundtrack, books, and manga as supplemental material. You can't just leave out crucial parts of the story just because you have a soundtrack to hold you up. Examples. Armed and Ready is a summary of most of Yang's character arc in Volume 4, an arc that lasted 5 minutes, went nowhere, and had no actual effect on Yang's character at all. Bumblebee exists to pander to Bumblebee shippers, and attempts to make Yang and Blake a thing more than they ever had the chemistry to be in the show. Now, you know what I think of Bumblebee and shipping in general, so I don't need to go into too much detail on that, but this problem isn't even exclusive to RWBY's later volumes. From Shadows, I like the song, but hear me out, tells a story about racism against the Faunus, the reason why the White Fang became an extremist group. A story we're only told bits and pieces of in the show, despite the White Fang being major antagonists, at least until they become completely irrelevant later on, because. It's My Turn is also a weird one, considering that if it's from the perspective of Weiss before or during her initial arrival at Beacon, it doesn't line up at all with the Weiss we saw at the beginning of the show, as if half her arc in the first 3 volumes has just been moved to a time before the show even started. And if it's from the perspective of Weiss at the time of Volume 3, the lyrics just don't make any sense. Anyway, that's my point. On to... Yang is training with Taiyang. He demonstrates pretty well that Yang needs a lot of work on her style of fighting. They talk about the flaws in her strategy, Taiyang saying she's too stubborn and relies on her semblance too much, 2 things that are seen in Volume 3. I'm actually surprised Taiyang actually gave advice that wasn't a bunch of meaningless platitudes. This scene was actually kinda not bad. I'm really excited to see how she addresses and attempts to fix those problems in the seasons to come. Cut to Weiss training, I think. Satan enters the room for no reason other than to be an asshole to Weiss, and yes, dialogue between these two still reaches Neil Breen levels of stilt. It's actually impressive. She asks him if he hates her because he's jealous, and he responds by saying that Huntsman stuff is beneath people like him and Jacques, and tries to say that Huntsmen are less effective than armies. 2 things. 1. Motherfucker, you sell dust. You literally supply Huntsmen with ammunition. Shut the fuck up. B. You're in some goddamn position to be talking about armies, considering literally all Atlas's army did at Beacon was fuck up everything and make the problem exponentially worse. You are a fucking idiot. Stop talking. She then successfully performs a hold on. We left Weiss when she was just getting ready to start practicing her summoning. She's just doing it flawlessly now? I'd like to be shown at least some of the events between Weiss prepares to train and Weiss successfully performs a summoning. You don't just skip all that, Ray. The butler's back. She asks him for a favor, and then cut to Blake and Sun pursuing the really bad spy. Jumping onto the sides of trees and being able to stand on leaves is a thing now. Blake doesn't know how to speak like a normal person. Sun is the only person in Menagerie with a brain, apparently, and masks don't conform to the laws of physics. But hey, we have a new character! Team I Don't Care Anymore split on whether to split up or stay together. They can't tell how far they are from the nearest populated village because John dropped their only map for no fucking reason and didn't go back for it, and Crow's condition is only getting worse. Ren and Nora want for them to take the mountain path and for Ruby and John to take Crow through Kuroyuri, while John wants to stay together to be able to maintain communication and be able to keep each other safe. Reminder that we wouldn't be having this problem if literally all wireless communication in the kingdom wasn't completely centralized within one fucking tower. Oh shit, one of the footprints from earlier that somehow Ruby didn't see. I'm not even going to try to ask why. Ruby doesn't have a brain anymore. Anyway, that's part 3. These were pretty fucking bad, but I'd say they're probably not as bad as some of the others. That's not to say any of them are close to anything even remotely resembling good. Again, whatever Murder of Birds is on, I want it. But most of the problems with these episodes come from bullshit writing in previous episodes or previous volumes, and other problems that Volume 4 had overall. Oh yeah, and remember when I said I would touch on the character aspect of the season in part 3? Yeah, that was back when I, for some reason, thought this season had 10 episodes instead of 12, and that I would only need to make 3 parts. I'll talk about what it did to the characters in part 4. Oh yeah! I almost forgot! Did you know that according to YouTube statistics, only 25% of you are actually subscribed? Be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon because subscribing doesn't mean jack shit anymore. Anyway, I'm gonna go back to attempting to surpass Boomy and Mario Super Sluggers. I'll see you next month. I thought you were done with Ruby.